Miss Congeniality follows Gracie Hart, an FBI agent who goes undercover as a beauty pageant contestant after a bomb threat on the Miss United States pageant. Though initially horrified at the idea of playing the part of a beauty queen, Gracie transforms under the watchful eye of a stylist and learns to befriend the girls she once looked down on, ultimately coming to understand that the men at the bureau may not take her or the other girls seriously, but she can still continue the investigation and save the lives of her new friends. Though it was a commercial success, critical response to the film was mixed and leaning towards the negative side, and like many movies marketed towards women in the 2000s, it wasn't taken particularly seriously. But I think that this film, and more importantly its sequel, are interesting to view through a feminist lens, and may actually have a lot to say about the tensions within contemporary feminist movements. Most of us are familiar with the not like other girls trope. When we talk about media that deconstructs this idea, a lot of people will bring up films like Legally Blonde, which rightly so has earned a reputation as an iconic film that challenges the idea that femininity and intelligence are inherently incongruent. Though I'm a huge fan of the Legally Blonde movie and musical, I think Miss Congeniality deserves its flowers too, especially since it actually came out before Legally Blonde. Hollywood has this tendency to show us airbrushed black and white feminism, and Gracie's gradual evolution in the way she thinks about gender is both refreshing and honest. Before going undercover, she's the embodiment of the not like other girls trope, constantly assuming that women who care about appearance or fashion are unintelligent, even when they demonstrate that they aren't.
Beth is an undergrad at Vassar. She's doing a paper on law enforcement.
It was nice meeting you.
You too. Hope you have a good time at the mall.
Gracie is explicitly characterized as a feminist at the beginning of the film, and it's clear she believes that empowered women are only those who are allowed to succeed at masculine roles and attributes. For her, this includes success in a male-dominated workplace, physical strength and practicality, as well as not being beholden to the mannerisms associated with being feminine. And we can easily see how these attributes were formed and maintained by the society she lives and works in. In the first scene in the movie, when Gracie's a child, she physically intervenes when one of her peers is being bullied, punching the attackers before checking to see if the boy is alright. He responds with anger that people will now think he needs a girl to protect him, seeing Gracie's actions as a failure of established gender roles and a threat to his own masculinity. Gracie, feeling hurt at this backlash, sees two options: change her actions and mannerisms to appear more successfully feminine and therefore palatable to boys, or double down and become one of the boys, rejecting feminine traits and embracing things like physical conflict as an attempt at empowerment. Upon viewing Gracie's adult life, we can see that she has chosen the latter. Her career choice is in a male-dominated field, she prides herself on physical strength and practicality, and her life is littered with instances of failures in traditional femininity, be they in her cooking, cleaning, appearance, or mannerisms. This is further reinforced by her workplace, where she spends most of her time. It's a space that punishes displays of femininity due to perceived weakness and impracticality. The most obvious example of this is the call Gracie makes to intervene when she sees a criminal choking, which results in her being held at knife point and a co-worker being shot. Although it's true that the choice leads to negative consequences, Gracie's action is disproportionately punished because of its perceived femininity, with her superiors seeing the choice as emotion-driven and illogical. Rather than being viewed as a risk that didn't pay off, it's seen as an inherently wrong choice, regardless of the result. We can see a repeat of this when Gracie makes a call to try and disarm a man that she thinks might be a legitimate threat to the pageant, leading to extremely negative reactions from her peers, even though she was just being overly cautious. The third time we see Gracie make a judgment call like this is in the last act of the film, when she realizes who's behind the bomb plot. By this point, her theory, which is supported by facts and evidence that she's gathered through thorough investigation and surveillance, is openly mocked by her colleagues, who dismiss it because they view the evidence as mindless gossip. They also hold a bias that women cannot be legitimate threats, dismissing Gracie's theory that a former pageant queen is behind the plot. Gracie's time at the pageant sees her form genuine friendships and connections with the other girls, beginning to shift both her ideas about feminism as a whole and her personal sense of self. She quickly learns that her judgments on pageant girls and feminine women in general are based on unfair gendered stereotypes, and because of this she learns to stand up for their interests when they're under threat. A great number of women in the film who engage in protest are seen as hysterical and dangerous rather than intelligent or driven, and Gracie finds herself having to defend their actions as the film goes on. Although I do think that the messages the movie sends around femininity are overall positive, I also have to admit that the film is very of its time. As much as I've painted the first movie as an underappreciated feminist masterpiece, it is essentially a fish-out-of-water makeover movie. For starters, Gracie's makeover is directly linked to her being viewed as a viable romantic interest. Obviously, this isn't unique to movies from this time period, or films marketed at women in general, and honestly, I think I could have looked past this part of the movie a little more if it wasn't for the fact that Eric had no romantic chemistry at all with Gracie before her makeover. Generally, movies from this era that feature a makeover narrative tend to follow a certain pattern. Man clearly likes woman but doesn't realize it yet. Woman goes through emotional journey which is aided by a physical makeover where she suddenly becomes beautiful by the standards of the society she lives in, and this external transformation leads to the man realizing that he's liked her all along and that she was a hidden beauty this whole time. And while obviously there's still some major issues with this storyline when viewed through a feminist lens, it does at the very least have the distinction that the two characters have had chemistry all along and clearly like each other. Feel free to try and prove me wrong, but I truly don't think that can be said about Eric and Gracie. His banter in the workplace doesn't read as flirty to me, and on the rare occasion it does, it comes across as creepy rather than romantic.
Come on, look, you do a few butt-shaping exercises, you tighten this up, you can pull this off.
You know what? Pull this off.
He only seems to develop any feelings towards her after he starts viewing her as attractive from a surface level. And again, while this is obviously problematic from a feminist lens, it wouldn't be quite so bad if not for one major point. He doesn't just see her as more physically attractive after a makeover, but views her as less capable and intelligent the more feminine she becomes, and the more she surrounds herself with and befriends the other girls. If the film were better written, his portrayal of confidence, leaving Gracie and refusing to believe her or back her up on her hunch about the bomber, would have been followed by a realization that he was wrong to judge her due to his own biases. Hell, if we wanted to keep it more in the vein of a 2000s chick flick, it wouldn't have even had to have been framed as a feminist movement. He could simply have chosen to return because he liked her too much to let anything stand in the way, even his job. But why does he decide to return? Because Victor, the stylist, makes a passing comment that happens to give weight to Gracie's theory. As it stands, his character doesn't develop or grow as a person, and the romance is one-dimensional and forced. The issues that this movie has and the time period it was made lead me to think that any feminist messages the film seems to convey aren't really intentional, or at least not intentional beyond a surface level. But I think it's pretty clear that I'm disregarding authorial intent and focusing on the incidental critiques that the film provides, which is going to be even more relevant for the second film. And this brings us to the masterpiece that is Miss Congeniality 2, Armed and Fabulous. From the get-go, this movie makes an improvement on the first by completely abandoning the terrible love interest. The premise of the sequel hinges on the fact that due to the publicity Gracie received over the pageant, she has become far too recognizable for undercover work. After being dumped by her boyfriend from the first film, she declines desk work and instead embraces her newfound fame, becoming the public face of the bureau, writing a bestseller and conducting press interviews. But when Cheryl, the winner of the recent pageant and Gracie's closest friend from her time undercover, is kidnapped along with host Stan Fields, she feels compelled to work on the case. Paired with Sam Fuller, an agent with anger issues who clearly doesn't like her, Gracie disobeys the orders of the Bureau to maintain her role as a symbolic figurehead and instead takes matters into her own hands. The film itself is ridiculously camp and received largely negative reviews from critics, which, as far as I'm concerned, already points to it being a better movie than the first. The plot pretty much beat for beat mirrors the first movie. You've got Gracie accidentally shooting a colleague in a high-stakes undercover setup, Gracie getting sidelined by FBI officials even though her hunch is based on real evidence, Gracie getting a makeover from a man who's too gay to function, Gracie jumping on an innocent bystander and getting in trouble, Gracie singing a mocking song to a person she's clearly in love with, Gracie saving Cheryl, the list goes on. While initially reluctant to become a Barbie for the FBI, after a 10-month transformation, Gracie has fully embraced her role in the public eye, designer outfits and all. She quickly becomes a thing she swore she wouldn't. When Gracie gives advice to other women and young girls, her role model status is misused. She swings so far into the idea that femininity need not be shameful that she bullies others into being empowered by embracing femininity, whether they actually feel comfortable expressing themselves that way or not. Gracie's advice to Priscilla, a young fan of her book, completely ignores her real interests and goals and actively shames her for being a tomboy. Sarah Zed's video on N-Logs sums this phenomenon up really well. In our attempts to criticize women who hold attitudes that they're not like the other girls because they aren't shallow and girly, we run the risk of generalizing these girls in the process and implying that what they enjoy or how they dress is also wrong. The very real societal bias against non-normative femininity is very easy to fall into unintentionally. Likewise, we also run the risk of ignoring the nuanced reasons that some women may feel the need to distance themselves from femininity completely. I think what I find so intriguing about both films is how honest Gracie's journey as a feminist is. She might not evolve into the kind of feminism I actually aspire to in the real world. After all, even by the end of Armed and Fabulous, she's still a neoliberal girlboss protagonist in a shallow propaganda movie, but there is something compelling about her arc that captures my attention more than any of the other pseudo-feminist films of the 2000s. Gracie, upon learning a lesson in the first film not to judge other women for femininity, then backslides completely in the second film and begins judging women who don't embrace femininity. She struggles with her own gendered presentation, struggles to call out sexism in the workplace, regurgitates the terrible sexist messages she's internalized to a younger generation, starts off without any consideration of intersectionality, and changes herself to be more appealing to men while expressing distaste that other women would do the same. Many of us have been through versions of these different phases that Gracie has. Every step of the way she makes mistakes, but she fundamentally cares about the women around her and addressing issues that she and her peers face. Armed and Fabulous doesn't just warrant a feminist analysis though, it also warrants a queer reading. It's very easy to view both films, especially the second, through a queer lens. Gracie's complex relationship with femininity and the lack of male love interest in the sequel means that many of the film's themes can easily be applied to the experiences of queer women. It's actually rumoured that Ellen DeGeneres inspired the writer to create the character of Gracie when he watched her training to walk in high heels and a dress in preparation for the Oscars. There's even a deleted scene in the first movie where Gracie's dad confronts her on the suspicion that she's a lesbian.
Honey, are you a lesbian?
Dad. I wish.
The movies have a host of secondary characters that are queer, and while most of them are representatives typical of the 2000s, there are some character additions that are more unusual for the time, such as the black femme lesbian in the first movie who's participating in the pageant as an act of political resistance.
I just want to let all the lesbians out there know, if I can make it to the top 10, so can you!
The second film plays a lot like a romance, especially considering how much of Gracie and Sam's partnership mirrors so much of the relationship in the first movie. Just as a side note though, it's worth pointing out that Sam very much fits into the angry black woman trope, and you could easily make an argument that the movie positions black women as being more naturally masculine compared to white women. Gender as performance is another theme evident in both films, but particularly in Armed and Fabulous. For one thing, the main characters spend a pretty significant chunk of the movie in drag. I would actually argue that Gracie spends nearly the whole movie in drag. As Judith Butler so aptly asks, is drag the imitation of gender, or does it dramatize the signifying gestures through which gender itself is established? Does being female constitute a natural fact, or a cultural performance, or is naturalness constituted through discursively constrained performance acts that produce the body through and within written categories of sex? I started drafting the script for this video all the way back in 2021, and at the time I had a huge section trying to explain that it was possible for cis women to be drag queens. Later that year, on the third season of Drag Race UK, Victoria Scone became the first cis queen in Drag Race history, and since then Chapel Roan has entered the mainstream. I think it's very illuminating that when asked some years ago about whether there would ever be a show that made space for cis women to explore drag, RuPaul responded with the tweet, "It already exists. It's called Miss Universe." A lot of times, women, whether they're cis or trans, are not taken seriously when they want to explore femininity as a performance. And I think it boils down to the fact that when they do, it's just another indication of just how bullshit the things that people associate with innate womanhood actually are. There's a subsection of feminists that think that drag is demeaning to women, or somehow a manifestation of men using their power to dominate women. And while I think this is ridiculous, I do think it's worth examining further. It's true that although drag is not some oppressive force seeking to make fun of women, and is in fact welcoming of all gendered performance, drag culture can sometimes be accompanied by an undercurrent of sexism, at least in more mainstream contexts. But I ultimately think it's precisely because drag involves this fraught and often stereotypical understanding of gender that it can be so subversive to gender norms. As Butler says, The notion of gender identity defended here does not assume that there is an original which such parodic identities imitate. Indeed, the parody is of the very notion of an original. Just as the psychoanalytic notion of gender identification is constituted by a fantasy of a fantasy, the transfiguration of another who is already a figure in the double sense, so gender parody reveals that the original identity, after which gender fashions itself, is an imitation without an origin. Although the gender meanings taken up in these parodic styles are clearly part of hegemonic, misogynistic culture, they are nevertheless denaturalized and mobilized through their parodic recontextualization. What Butler is essentially saying is that because drag is a part of culture, and our culture is misogynistic in the way it enforces gender, drag performers imitating our cultural understandings of gender will inevitably have some elements of misogyny present. However, it isn't drag itself that's misogynistic, because what a drag queen is parodying is not a universal concept of womanhood, but society's belief that there is a universal concept of womanhood in the first place. When we see a drag queen performing all those things that we believe to be markers of womanhood, it makes us question why we see those things as natural and essential in the first place. And if we take Butler's example to its logical extreme, that is especially the case in the example of cis women becoming drag queens. If they exaggerate markers of femininity on stage, then it forces us to think how much of femininity is exaggerated off stage. And aren't RuPaul's comments a little bit true? Are cis women in beauty pageants not, by technical definition, competing in drag shows? In the Nylon article, It's Time to Change the Definition of Drag, Eric Shorey outlines a more up-to-date definition than the stereotypical view of drag being exclusively the domain of cis men performing as women. If I were to offer a new definition of drag, it would be this: a genre of performance delivered in the medium of gender. Or perhaps costume exaggerating gender signifiers. A form of entertainment in which a performer assumes a theatrical guise of maleness, femaleness, in-betweenness, none of the aboveness, in and for a performance. Do beauty pageants qualify then? Well, they are certainly an entertaining performance delivered in the medium of gender. I don't know that I'd call them a theatrical guise, but I do think it's possible to argue that they involve costumes exaggerating gender signifiers. After all, not many women wear ball gowns in their day-to-day life. Whether or not Miss United States and associated real-life beauty pageants constitute drag, I would argue that Gracie specifically is in drag for most of the first movie. It's worth noting that most definitions of drag involve an element of transformation into a parody of something that is different than what you are, or a parody of gender norms and practices that are expected of you and others. We certainly see this transformative and performative practice when Gracie attends the pageant. She even has a name that she sees as a parody of the expectations of feminine women, much like a drag name, Gracie Lou Freebush. She sees the dress, the makeup, the hair, all as a parodic performance. Sure, she's doing it for a job, but there's an element of entertainment to it. She likes creating a caricature of the type of womanhood she's tried to reject her whole life. Quote, "The loss of the sense of the normal, however, can be its own occasion for laughter, especially when the normal, the original, is revealed to be a copy, and inevitably a failed one, an ideal that no one can embody. In this sense, laughter emerges in the realization that all along, the original was derived." But what about the second film? This time, Gracie isn't just going undercover in a gender representation she doesn't identify with, she's living that representation full time. In becoming the face of the FBI, she's required to internalize all those facets of womanhood she doesn't naturally embody. But the audience knows it's a joke. We see clearly that though she appears to be fulfilling these expectations on a day-to-day level, it's obvious that how she presents is silly. And I don't mean silly as in it's true feminine, but silly as in it's clearly not her. The inclusion of Dolly Parton in this film is an interesting one because she represents a clear comparison. Dolly is someone who presents in exaggerated feminine ways because it's authentic to her identity. Maybe it is a parody and a performance in some way, but she's in on the joke. She's also part of the audience. Now, although I've referred to parody a lot, Butler actually makes the point that the term pastiche is probably more appropriate here, quoting Jameson's definition of pastiche that suggests, "Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique style, the wearing of a stylistic mask, speech in a dead language. It is a neutral practice of mimicry, without parody's ulterior motive, without the satirical impulse, without laughter, without that still latent feeling that there exists something normal compared to which what is being imitated is rather comic. Pastiche is blank parody, parody that has lost its humour. And I would argue that while the first film deals with gender presentation in the parodic sense, the second deals in pastiche. At some point, Gracie's imitation of gender presentation isn't funny anymore. Aside from the fact that she's struggling to meet impossible standards and compromising her core self, we see how much the entire concept of gender is becoming shaky. Troublesome, if you will. Gracie trying so hard to present this specific feminine persona and getting so close but still kind of failing is very relatable to me because I've done the exact same thing. The thing is, you wouldn't immediately look at Gracie and the way she presents and think that she was performing, but as audience members, we can see that's the case. She's trying to embody something that she thinks should come naturally to her and just doesn't at all. She's performing to an audience she's not a part of. She's not in on the joke. Quote, "And yet, this failure to become real and embody the natural is, I would argue, a constitutive failure of all gender enactments for the very reason that these ontological locales are fundamentally uninhibitable. Hence, there is a subversive laughter in the pastiche effect of parodic practices in which the original, the authentic, are themselves constituted effects." When we see Gracie failing at the branded femininity she tries to achieve, it's supposed to be funny, but it also feels a little uncomfortable. We see just how ridiculous and essential femininity is and how impossible it is to achieve for so many people. In arguing that gender is a social construct, Butler suggests that part of what gender involves is a set of repeated acts. Gracie attempts to create a gender identity that doesn't reflect who she is through an intricate web of repeated acts, and she fails. Her sudden need to cling to a false version of her own femininity after the male gaze is removed from her life, followed by a breakdown of the persona she tried to embody, is something a lot of people who identify as lesbians experience. Quote, "Briefly, one is a woman, according to this framework, to the extent that one functions as one within the dominant heterosexual frame, and to call the frame into question is perhaps to lose something of one's sense of place in gender." Let's not forget that the inciting incident of Armed and Fabulous is Gracie being dumped by her male love interest, which leaves her questioning how her gender presentation affects her life. All of the complicated feelings she harbors about gender are perfectly explored in the final few scenes when she dresses in drag in the more traditional sense. Here, both she and the audience are forced to view what she's been doing up till now in the context of performance. Gracie is finally in on the joke, part of the audience of her own performance, and is liberated by not choosing a type of femininity, but by accepting that she is indeed a performer on some level, even when it's just for herself. Right away, we see the theme of performance being introduced in the opening sequence of Armed and Fabulous. She's literally disguised using a feminine character, that of an innocent and non-threatening mother. When she's at home, her everyday look has clearly been impacted by her lessons from the first movie. She's now wearing a skirt, her overall styling is softer, she's embraced femininity in a way that suits her, without compromising her natural mannerisms. While her personal sense of style has been altered by her time in the pageant, her professional attire has not. The version of herself that she presents at work remains unchanged, appearance and all. It's easy to see why her co-workers still have the same attitude towards femininity that they did in the first movie, that it's frivolous and laughable. Interestingly, Gracie doesn't accept the offer of a makeover until she learns that the man who rejected her has completely moved on. The catalyst for another appearance change is this time not motivated by what's best for her professionally, but because of her emotional reaction towards rejection. As established, Eric's interest in her was inherently linked to her makeover in the first film, and when she's rejected by him, she falls into a trap of wanting to alter her appearance in order to feel valid again. Her stylist even brings up her breakup as a reason to have a makeover. It's not dissimilar to a revenge body. Once again, Gracie has an intrinsic distaste for the fact that her change in appearance must be equated with a change in behavior, but it's clear she's basically willing to change herself however she can to get a sense of power back. She feels rejected, cut out of her career, friendless, and disillusioned by the fact that though she has evolved her own view of femininity, her workplace remains as backward as ever, so she completely accepts not only the makeover, but the toxic messaging that comes along with it. She later regurgitates the same line her stylist uses, "People care about people who care about themselves," to justify spreading the misogynistic messaging she's internalized. The choice to have a time skip doesn't just work in the plot's favour, it allows the costume design to tell a story too. we can see a drastic change in Gracie's appearance and mannerisms. This isn't like the few days of the pageant, this makeover has become her whole life. In the 10 months of the time skip, her whole demeanour has changed. At the media interview, we see her wearing more traditional clothes with excessive amounts of pearls and frills to signal a grown-up professional image of a woman. Things she didn't care about before are now being implicitly shown as important to her, such as her hair with the new highlights, her nails, and her achievements in the world of beauty. The book that Gracie published about her life during the 10-month period makes a very meta comment about performance. Its cover is literally the cover of the real-life DVD of the first movie. We can see how Gracie's life and her status as a minor celebrity from her time at the pageant is being presented to the public for entertainment. She's losing her identity beyond the image that she's presented as. The choices in colour reveal a lot as well. Yellow and pink are used symbolically throughout the movie in creative ways to represent femininity in all its various cultural stereotypes. Gracie consistently wears softer pink when she's trying to appease the public and her bosses, but wears yellow, which highly contrasts those around her when she's making a stand and sticking up for herself. The way she expresses her identity, which is inherently tied up with work, is through uniform. The outfits she wears post-makeover are designer rather than utilitarian workwear. As the film goes on, they become more absurd, and there are moments where they mirror, either by colour or texture, the drag outfit that she wears at the end of the movie, which definitely contributes to the whole "she's actually in drag the whole movie" analysis. The costumes are undoubtedly ridiculous, and combined with Gracie's sudden shift in mannerisms and attitude, it can be tempting to say that it's unrealistic she would suddenly embrace such an outrageous version of femininity. But I don't think it's completely outrageous just how much she changes. Rather, I think it's an effective exaggeration of the way women who feel broken down by misogyny paradoxically internalize a performative concept of womanhood. It can also be read as the phenomenon a lot of queer and particularly a lot of trans and non-binary people experience, where at certain points in their lives, they will often try and overcompensate in a performed version of their assigned gender at birth, often feeling that they're not quite getting it right, but not understanding why. What becomes clear through the use of drag costuming is that there is a clear disparity between Gracie's actual preferred style versus how she thinks she should dress to reflect certain aspects of herself. Costumes in Miss Congeniality, like any good film, are used as a medium that shows the character's internal journey and growth and reflects the outside pressures they must adhere to. But just as in the real world, there's only so far that clothes can take you. What constitutes as a wave of feminism is confusing at best and reductive at worst. But generally speaking, you've got the first wave, which focused on political gains like the suffrage movement, where women fought for the right to vote. Following this was the second wave, which is generally associated with radical feminism. It covered a lot of ground, but largely dealt with issues of sexual violence, objectification, reproductive rights, domestic violence, and oppressive gender roles. And in the modern day, we're dealing with a lot of different postmodern feminist approaches. Radical feminism's biggest criticism is that it's often been underpinned by essentialist and bioessentialist thinking. Radical feminists that take essentialist thinking to an extreme view patriarchy as inherent in a way that lacks nuance and intersectionality. There are a few ways that bioessentialism in the second wave led to intense internal political debate. We usually refer to these historical debates as the feminist sex wars or sometimes the lesbian sex wars, because they focus so heavily on debating feminist ideas about lesbian sexuality, pornography, rough sex, and sex work. It's also the era of feminist thought credited with the origins of the TERF movement. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, those who reject trans people from their feminism. Of course, not every person who considered themselves part of the second wave was a radical feminist. And not every radical feminist was anti-sex work, transphobic, or a lesbian separatist. However, the point is that a fair few were, and they were very vocal about it. And even though these movement splintering debates happened in the 70s and 80s, most of us who weren't alive for that period are still very familiar with them because radical feminist debate has made a huge comeback in recent years. I've noticed that the resurgent radfem movement tends to mock its critics by painting all other feminist perspectives with the same brush, implying that anyone who disagrees with them is a neoliberal feminist. So to be absolutely clear on where I stand, I don't support neoliberal feminism because I don't support neoliberalism. And I think this reactionary second wave resurgence hasn't just been about valid pushback of neoliberal feminism. It's also sought to undermine much of the progress we've made with intersectional feminism. Nearly all of the online radfems I've ever encountered have been bigoted and unnuanced. and narrowly and obsessively focused on trans people and sex workers in ways that ultimately harm both of those populations. In my last video, I mentioned briefly how I think radical feminism can easily be weaponized against vulnerable women, and I had a lot of radfems in my comment section telling me that I got radical feminism all wrong. And then they promptly linked me to transphobic radical feminist sources that reinforce that belief. I'm not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I understand why we're seeing a resurgence in second wave thinking. It's because the goals from the 60s and 70s were never really achieved. First wave feminism was defined largely by the fight for the right to vote, and that right was pretty much achieved in the Western world with the obvious caveat that it was for white women only to begin with, and that intersectional and systemic issues of voter oppression still exist today. But second wave feminism, with its goals of ending sexual violence and unequal domestic labor, well, we're not even close. In the face of some pretty bleak realities of gender inequality, people are returning to second wave thinking in droves. And while I think many second wave ideas deserve to be applied to the problems facing modern feminists, I don't have tolerance for essentialism and bigotry. And unfortunately, I think that's largely what the loudest voices in the resurgent second wave have been pushing. A sudden, violent resurgence in transphobia dressed up in feminist language. Straight and bisexual women saying it's embarrassing that they're attracted to men. Intense policing of sex workers. Second wave and radical feminism is making a comeback, and with it, so too are the sex wars and the political infighting that plagued the movement decades ago. But okay, what does this have to do with Miss Congeniality? Like I said, the first film represents to a T a takedown of the not like other girls mindset. It challenges the idea that femininity, including sexual femininity, is inherently bad and oppressive. It's basically the perfect third wave feminist film in that it both illustrates the good and the bad of this era of feminism. Gracie starts out subscribing to a not like other girls viewpoint and ends up realizing that this viewpoint doesn't necessarily help the women she thinks it does. It's great fun and I love it a lot, but it's also a kind of shallow film that doesn't engage with the critiques of third wave feminism. But the second film does something more, or at least I feel like it does. It shows us a scale from radical to postmodern feminist perspectives and says that it isn't enough to swing one way or the other on a personal ideological scale. You have to consider context and nuance. Let's start by looking at the phrase world peace itself. At the beginning of the first film, it's used as a joke. The women at the pageant are painted as shallow, sheep-like airheads. The answer they all give is supposed to be a substanceless crowd pleaser that requires little analytical thinking, just uninformed optimism. The joke is that Gracie, who is seen by herself and others at this point as better educated than the average pageant girl, gives a real answer that is analytical and potentially contentious before realizing what the crowd and the other pageant girls want to hear. The same shallow answer. But by the end of her time at the pageant, Gracie, as well as the audience, come to understand that world peace is a sentiment that does genuinely mean a lot to these girls. Far from shallow, it speaks to their desire for philanthropy and social change. Just because these values and goals are linked to femininity doesn't mean they're any less important or academic. World peace isn't necessarily just a single goal, but a stand-in for a more complex ethos. When I watched a series of compilations on the quote-unquote worst beauty pageant answers, it struck me that a lot of these answers weren't actually unintelligent. Sure, some of the women were nervous or struggling due to language barriers, but that doesn't make them unintelligent. And while they seem to rely on the answer of education as a crutch for almost every global problem, they're not exactly wrong. From a theoretical standpoint, outside of the film, world peace cannot be fully achieved without it. While the popular idea that educating women in the global south will directly reduce rates of terrorism and war has been critiqued for being oversimplistic, peace education undoubtedly suffers when the global education of women and girls is not considered. Quote, "Sex-based inequality in all its many manifestations is a form of violence, no matter how invisible or normalized that violence may be. This sex-based violence not only destroys homes, but we believe it also significantly affects politics and security at both national and international levels. This linkage, empirical as well as theoretical, between sex-based inequality and national and international security is an approach that has seldom been considered within the discipline of international relations, and other disciplines as well. In a major shift from the conventional understanding, we suggest that efforts to establish greater peace and security through the world are more effective when they also address the violence and exploitation that occur in personal relationships between the two halves of humanity." Miss Congeniality 2, Armed and Fabulous, takes the idea of world peace further than the first movie. Gracie keeps the lessons she learned from her time at the pageant around non-judgment of her peers' optimistic feminine ethos, but also learns another valuable lesson: the peace as an inner feeling of one's identity is just as important. To begin with, Gracie, with her newfound feminine persona, lacks a sense of inner peace because how she presents for most of the movie is just a performance. It stops her authentic personality, ambitions, and values from shining through. That's not to say that femininity as a whole prevents Gracie from being herself. After all, we see how much more confident she is in expressing herself after her time in the pageant. But it's clear that while the hyper-feminine persona she creates may be right for some people, it doesn't feel right for her. She also seems to feel that she needs to adjust her demeanor and personality to be more traditionally feminine in order to be allowed to enjoy feminine interests. Which, again, while not inherently bad, means that in this case she ends up unable to be herself. Not to mention the fact that her specific brand of newfound femininity seems inherently linked to her job. She seems unable to separate her identity as a person from the persona she presents at work. In the first movie, Gracie's character development is her learning not to judge women based on outdated ideas about femininity. But in the second, she goes beyond that, to understanding that feminist discourse is worthless if it doesn't allow for every person's identity to bring them inherent peace. If we look structurally at the ways women have been oppressed throughout history, it would be reasonable to assume that the beauty industry is a tool of oppression. From a theoretical point of view, one might take this assumption and suggest that women who spend large amounts of time, effort, and money on things like makeup or fashion are victims of patriarchy and should desist doing these things immediately if they want to be liberated. On the other hand, some people argue that if we look structurally at the way women have been oppressed throughout history, it's been about devaluing anything associated with femininity, which includes frivolity. From this theoretical view, things like fashion are actually empowering, and women shouldn't be ashamed of them in order to feel empowered. Gracie starts with the first theoretical perspective and jumps ship to the second by the end of the film. And that's all well and good, but both perspectives kind of miss the point. That the lives of women that have been oppressed are not theoretical. People's identity doesn't and shouldn't depend on what makes them theoretically liberated. It should be based on what brings them peace and allows them to live their lives happily while still recognizing the societal pressures they've been conditioned under, in this case capitalism and patriarchy. Again, since I know I'm going to get pushback from red fans, I want to stress that this is an example in the context of the film. Obviously, it goes without saying that the beauty industry, especially makeup, plastic surgery, and hair removal, deserve far more anti-capitalist feminist critique than they currently receive in mainstream feminism. But there's a way to have these conversations while also recognizing just how hard it is to exist as a woman under beauty capitalism, within a nuanced intersectional framework. But the beauty industry is one thing and identity is another. The separatists who identified publicly as lesbians, even if they never personally experienced any romantic or sexual attraction to women, did this because they theoretically believed that all men were oppressive and that women who entered into relationships with men were choosing oppression. And this mindset continues today with biphobic sentiments expressed at bisexual women who choose to be with a man when they had the less oppressive option of being with a woman. These mindsets paint oppression as essentialist, and again, ignore that people's identity is not about theory, it's about peace. A bisexual woman who dates or marries a man isn't choosing oppression, she's falling in love. And the fact that some people would prefer that someone lie about the core of who they are shows that none of this is actually about ending oppression. If we took this line of thinking and ran with it, no person in a minority group could ever find any peace in the way they express themselves. A butch lesbian would be seen as playing to stereotypes and heteronormative ideas about relationship dynamics, and a femme lesbian would be seen as pandering to the male gaze and using the privileged position of femininity to avoid homophobia. A non-binary person whose fashion is gender non-conforming would be seen as a stereotype trying to perform perfect androgyny, but may also be seen as using their label for attention should they not attempt to dress outside the norms of their assigned gender. I'm not saying we can't be critical of the way socialization and power affect our identities and relationships. We absolutely should. We can all benefit from thinking about things like compulsory heterosexuality and allonormativity and how they might have impacted our perception of ourselves and our relationships. But treating identities as hierarchical choices used to get ahead in life is cruel and disingenuous. Quote, "It is also troubling if the focus on personal liberation takes attention away from the true power of political organizing. Having transgressive sex can be individually powerful, but it rarely changes the greater structure of politics, law, and culture that continues to shame alternative lifestyles and sex, and enforce other regressive norms for everyone else. I think that it's worth noting that in the book this quote is taken from, Chen also suggests this tendency to focus on individual liberation is often true for upper-class white feminists. There's a lot to criticize about the way Sam is portrayed throughout Armed and Fabulous. I think she falls into a lot of lazy and potentially damaging stereotypes about black women. But in a way, I do think that Gracie's mansplaining of liberation and femininity adds something to a feminist analysis, because if we're going to critique self-serving beliefs about femininity being individually liberating, we can't do it without acknowledging race and class and the impact of white feminism. I find myself so drawn in by the second film, despite all its flaws. It makes me sad that most people I know who love the original Miss Congeniality have never seen the sequel. Whenever I watch it, it always fills me with a little bit of hope, the way that camp trashy media has a tendency to. The climactic scene of Armed and Fabulous, in which Gracie is rescuing Cheryl, who's been trapped underwater by her kidnappers, sees the feathers of her ridiculously camp costume get caught, preventing her from swimming to the surface to breathe. The fact that the costume in question is a drag queen outfit, the explicit representation of exaggerated feminine excess, is very apt. The costume is representative of femininity manifest through culture, particularly the repeated acts of fashion and frivolity. What Gracie needs in that moment is not someone to tell her she's trapped herself by wearing it, or that she's been empowered by embracing femininity. She's literally drowning. What she needs is someone to help and support her. She cannot move the structural barrier that prevents her from surfacing by herself. And she gets that support from a woman who doesn't share her exact identity or gender expression. Too often, we think about feminism in media as a kind of seesaw. Pop feminism likes to present narratives that show women learning to embrace femininity or learning to reject it. Miss Congeniality could easily have leaned into the seesaw effect, and it does to an extent, presenting Gracie as having gone too far with the way she does gender, in the same way that it presented her disdain for femininity in the first film as too far. Quote, "Sex-positive feminists have focused on freedom too. Freedom to have sex, freedom to enjoy ourselves, freedom to do the things that men do without unjust inhibition caused by a double standard. They were right. Sex-negative feminists were concerned with freedom from being treated as sexual objects, freedom from feeling obligated to have sex to show that we were cool, freedom from the idea that sex is good by default. All these perspectives deserve consideration. I, for one, am not pro-sex. I am not sex-positive or sex-negative. I am pro-pleasure." Take this quote, apply it to femininity. When it comes to liberation, particularly in feminist circles, this line of thinking can apply to nearly every issue. We can use so many different identity labels to describe personal experience with gender and sexuality. And we can also waste a lot of time wondering about what those identities mean theoretically. But in an ideal world, they would be treated completely neutrally. You can use a lot of different theories to describe the kind of feminism I'd like to see more of in the world. But in the spirit of Miss Congeniality, I'd say that what I want, simply, is world peace. Hi everyone, thank you for watching, and thank you so much for everyone that watched the Ella Enchanted video essay. I obviously did not expect that many people to watch. My first essay, the Doctor Who one, had only 100 and something views at the time that I uploaded the Ella Enchanted one. So I was not anticipating over 1 million people to watch it, and I'm very, very grateful for everyone that watched it and that commented and shared some like really touching and personal stories. I was a little overwhelmed by how many people watched, so I didn't reply to many comments, but I did read through everything that everyone said, and I'm just so grateful for all of the support and constructive feedback. And yeah, I do plan on making more essays in the future, so if you would like to see more, please do stick around, subscribe, and thank you again.